A spiritual path. The steps are a path to spiritual growth. There is no separation between the spiritual part and the rest of our program. Just as the facets of a diamond are not separate from the stone, the spiritual aspects of our program are not separate parts. They're perspectives on the whole. It's all spiritual. Our understanding of what that means may change over time. Sometimes we think of spiritual principles as separate from the actions we need to take, but in fact they are connected. Spiritual principles give us a language through which we develop our values and learn to live by them. The principles describe our beliefs, our actions, and the reasons we act. Our relationship to the principles we practice is creative. We learn from day to day to use them in new ways, in new combinations, to better express who we are and to help the people around us. When we understand them better, we are able to act more consistently with what we believe. As we practice spiritual principles, we discover that this doesn't make us spiritual at all. Instead, we are awakening to what has been going on inside us our whole lives. Spirituality is our natural state. Awakening to our spirituality. We are not the only people who have spiritual awakenings, but there is a particular awakening we experience as a result of working the steps. We awaken to our own spirituality. We are newly alive to the world around us. We see more clearly and feel more acutely, and that isn't always comfortable. Some of our members believe that the most important spiritual awakening occurs when we walk in the doors of Narcotics Anonymous and we spend the rest of our recovery trying to understand what happened. For others of us, awakening, like so much else in recovery, seems to happen in layers. "The fog pulled back to where I could see how much fog there was," said one. "Each time it pulls back, I see more on the horizon. I have a sense of how big it is and how much I still can't see. With a little luck, I'll be waking up more and more my whole life." Some of us have awakened spiritually with an overwhelming sense of a power greater than ourselves. Others have shared a slow, gentle reviving of spiritual awareness. Whether or not we ever experience a sense of a higher power, the discovery that others care about us can be a spiritual awakening. For the first time, we recognize that we matter. Living according to principles leads us to humility, a greater awareness of our place in the world, and our ability to live comfortably in it. We often hear at meetings, "The most important thing to understand about a higher power is that you ain't it." Whatever it takes for us to realize that we are not the center of the universe, it's worth it. We may be too clever to declare ourselves a supreme being, but our self-centered disease still tells us that we are responsible for much more than we could ever possibly control. When we practice living in harmony with our world, we become wiser about choosing our battles. We learn where we can use our energy to make a difference and where we need to let go. Learning to step away from a conflict once it has started is sometimes harder than not getting into conflicts at all. That doesn't mean that we always agree with anyone and everything, or that we suddenly lose the power to stand for what's right. On the contrary, we learn when to step forward and when to back away. Some struggles are worth fighting even if we know we cannot win, just as some are not worth fighting even though our victory is sure. This is discernment, and it comes from our experience. We learn to tell the difference between a principle we need to stand for and an opinion that we just won't let go of. We are able to choose for ourselves when to stand up and when to surrender, and as we practice, we get better at determining which is right for us. Learning to accept the things we cannot change and take action where it is appropriate is not just part of recovering from addiction, it is part of growing up. Many of us are like overgrown children, still wanting to have things our way without regard for anything else. Often this means that we go through a painful adolescence in the rooms, whatever our age. Maturity comes to us when we use spiritual principles rather than defects to deal with reality. Incorporating principles into our lives allows us to understand the difference between right and wrong. Many of our most crippling defects become powerful assets when we let go of self-centered fear. Many times in our addiction, we experienced a moment of clarity, when we could see the truth about what we had become. But that awareness in itself did not bring change. Effort is necessary for change to occur. Our lives change because we take action. Some of us say that we are applying spiritual principles because it means we're acting in some particular way. Others of us prefer to say we are practicing principles because we know we can always get better at it. However we say it, action is what matters. Our primary action is surrender, and we come back to it every day. There's always room to let go a little more. There's great freedom in understanding that we always have the option to surrender. In the beginning, we may be confused and think we need to surrender to our disease. In fact, that's what most of us were doing before we got here. In active addiction, we turned our will over to our disease every day. In recovery, we learn to surrender to the process, to the program, and ultimately to a power greater than ourselves. When we give up the battle, we place ourselves entirely in the care of a power greater than ourselves. It follows naturally that we commit ourselves to the service of that power, however we understand it. Surrender means having the open-mindedness to see things in a new way, as well as the willingness to live differently. When we open ourselves to new perspectives, we may find more questions where we had hoped to see answers. Each time we can see possibilities that had not occurred to us before, we gain a little more freedom. We are free to change our minds, to change our perspective, and to change our lives. Freedom means that we are no longer living by default. More and more we see how much courage surrender requires. We see the miracle of recovery in action when an addict we didn't think would make it actually gets the message. We can see new hope in their eyes. The contrast is so sharp that we can't miss it. We can also recognize the miracle when we find words a suffering addict needs to hear, even though we didn't think we knew what to say. When we hear ourselves carry a powerful message, we know we are being helped as much as the person we are reaching out to. Finding that we already have the answers we need is like finding a gift on our doorstep. When we are having a hard time, the best thing we can do for ourselves is to accept that gift by helping someone else. A spiritual, not religious program. Each of us has our own spiritual path. As we explore our spirituality, we find ourselves on a journey of self-discovery. When we live with spiritual awareness, we find harmony with the God of our understanding, with ourselves, and with others. There is no single recipe for spirituality. Each of us finds our own way to live spiritually, and that allows us freedom to make choices about how we live. It also charges us with responsibility. We cannot pretend that spirituality is not central to the NA program or the NA way of life. But there is room within that for people of all beliefs, including those with no belief at all. Our right to our own spirituality in NA is unconditional, and that also means we must allow that right to others. It's not very complicated, but this is one area of our recovery that we seem to love to complicate. Any single definition of spiritual principles would be too restrictive for us. Our traditions remind us that NA is not a place where any single spiritual path is endorsed. Finding a spirituality that works for us can be one of the most important challenges that we face in recovery, and yet we are often afraid to talk about it. We may worry that we will feel out of place or that others will be uncomfortable with what we are sharing. When we are carrying the message, we learn to make the boundary clear between our personal spiritual experiences and the message of NA. Finding a balance in which we are open to one another's experience without creating the impression that we are endorsing a particular religion can be a struggle. While we may pursue a religion or path that uses specific language to refer to spiritual concepts, we ask ourselves how we can express that in a way we can all understand. We use more general language out of respect for all the various perspectives in the fellowship, even though in another setting we might use language more specific to our own particular faith. It can be difficult to find a way to talk about our spirituality and still leave the door open for everyone to have their own path as well. We use many different words to describe our higher power. We do our best to share our deepening spiritual experience in a way that makes it available to everyone in the room. Most importantly, we find people we trust and respect with whom we feel comfortable sharing one-on-one. The work doesn't all happen in meetings. We share and explore with our sponsor and step work or among our trusted friends. We may not ever have to leave NA to find our spirituality, but if our spiritual explorations take place outside the rooms, it is crucial that we understand that NA welcomes us back from every new voyage. Each time we have new understanding to share and new challenges to work through as a result of our spiritual growth. One of the most beautiful things about our program is that it works regardless of our different beliefs. NA needs to be a place where we all feel welcomed. Even when we're pretty sure everyone in the room shares the same faith, we still need to make sure that the NA message is clear. We don't limit our application of the traditions to those times when we can see a problem they seem to solve. Keeping our message clear helps us all. The more I learn to share my spirituality in NA language, the more clearly I can see the connections between my faith and NA, a member explained. When we find ways to share our new insights using our common language of recovery, our ability to carry the NA message strengthens. Our fellowship matures and develops as each of us brings our increasing understanding to the table. We grow from one another's experience when we are willing to share and to listen with an open mind. Even though it is so central to our recovery, many of us resist talking about spirituality because it comes so close to a conversation about religion. There are many reasons we may be uncomfortable with this. First of all, it's something many of us have learned not to discuss. We know faith is deeply personal. Others of us don't have any way of talking about it without trying to bring other people's faith in line with our own. We already need to change so much that it's important for us to know that our system of faith, whatever it is, will not be threatened by our program. It may be challenged, though, as we begin to practice our spirituality more actively than we had. We can have philosophical discussions all day long and never make any progress in our spiritual lives. On the other hand, some of the most spiritual people we know say very little about spirituality. Their quiet example is more powerful than words. The principles we share in the steps, the traditions, the concepts, and the rest of our literature go a long way toward providing us with a common language we can all understand and identify with. We say over and over that this is a spiritual, not religious program, but that doesn't mean the program can't work for religious people. Some of us come to NA with a foundation in a faith with which we are very comfortable. Others of us find our way to organized religion as a result of the work we do to build a relationship with a higher power in the steps. Some of us find alternative spiritual paths or find that the spirituality we achieve through the program is enough. There is no right or wrong answer on this. There is no progression that brings us naturally toward or away from organized religion. What is important is that we accept that this program is spiritual in nature. That some of what we depend on here is a great mystery, that some of it doesn't make sense. Many of us say that even after years clean, we still don't know how it works. We just know that it works. Allowing the possibility that there will always be something we don't know means that there is always room for something greater than ourselves to work on us and through us. Some of us have maintained the religious beliefs we grew up with, but in our addiction we compromised ourselves in ways that ran deeply against those beliefs. Many of us had to work so hard to distance ourselves from what our beliefs had been that the way we respond to hearing about them almost feels like analogy. It can be a long time before we know why that language makes us so uncomfortable. When we start hearing people talk about a higher power, it can feel like we're about to be pushed through all those feelings again. And it's natural that this makes us nervous. We may have negative experiences with religion, or experiences that made our relationship to religion uncomfortable. It can be challenging to face that. Many of us experienced religious efforts to save us from our addiction, and found that faith alone was insufficient to set us free. Or we may have very well developed religious faith, and fear that NA is going to ask us to give that up. Whatever our experience, it is critical to our recovery that we find some kind of understanding we can work with. When we are in the process of figuring that out, other people's opinions about what that should be can feel confusing or threatening. It is imperative that we give one another time and space to come to a belief system of our own. On the other hand, we can be too quick to cut off conversations that some of us need to have in order to reconcile our recovery with our other beliefs. A member confessed, "I've had a struggle with my faith since coming to NA. I still practice the faith I grew up with and have been very active in it since I got clean. But when I came into the rooms and shared about my spiritual awakenings, I felt shut down. I left for a while to follow that path, but I realized I need to be here too. So I find a way to make peace with the gap between them. Without that effort, we risk alienating people or limiting our own understanding of the connections between our spiritual development and our experience in recovery." Spiritual growth may be a struggle sometimes, but that doesn't mean it's going badly. That struggle is often how we get to a spirituality that works for us. Our beliefs grow as our spirits awaken. When we actually experience our beliefs, they become more vital. For some of us, that means finding a style of prayer that resonates with us. Some of us find other ways to make a conscious contact that suits our beliefs. But the key to spiritual growth is that it is growth, which means it changes, and it's going to change us. A member shared, "When I had around 10 years clean, I realized I wasn't being honest in my relationship with God because I was pretending I wasn't angry. I realized if I wasn't honest in that relationship, how did any of my other relationships stand a chance? Each time we recognize an opportunity for spiritual growth, we experience a reawakening of hope." A spiritual journey. Seeking a God of our understanding is a personal experience, but we need to know we are not alone in our search. There is a part of this that is very private, unspeakable in a wonderful way. There are times when we must walk alone with our higher power. As we study the traditions, we learn that nothing which affects our personal recovery is an outside issue, and also that our unity must come first. These spiritual principles are not in conflict, but it might take some thought or prayer to reconcile them. When we are living spiritually, awareness and empathy guide us in our recovery and in our sharing. In the 11th step, we ask for the power to carry out God's will for us. In that spirit, we may ask for the words we need to talk about our experience without creating separation or disunity around us. We need to be able to open up about our journey. It doesn't matter so much what names we give the markers along that road. When we learn to share about our feelings and experiences without naming names, we discover the freedom anonymity has to offer us. We may be surprised at how much we have in common with others who seem to be on very different spiritual paths. When we begin to see the things our journeys have in common, we find that our differences really can help us along the way, instead of creating barriers between us. It can be difficult to express our spiritual experience in words. Because we're talking about things unseen, concrete language usually falls short of what we experience, and the language we have to talk about our spiritual experiences with is often borrowed from other places. It takes practice to make it our own. When we're struggling to find words for our experience, the last thing we need to be told is that we are doing it wrong. We listen to one another with an open mind and an open heart, and we share our experience with the understanding that it won't necessarily be shared by everyone else. In the same spirit, we understand that it's hard for other people to share about this too, and that sometimes we are going to hear things that ask us to be objective and non-judgmental. We each find a way to surrender, but that does not mean we all come to believe in God. Many of our members have been clean for years as atheists. For some of us, coming to believe that NA can accommodate our atheism has itself been a leap of faith. We are welcome no matter what we believe. NA has no opinion on how our members define or practice spirituality. Our individual challenge is to find a definition of spirituality that makes sense to us. By listening carefully with an open mind to a range of members, opinions, and experiences, we form our own understanding that we can use in our own recovery. A member shared, "I didn't hear anyone talking about atheism as a legitimate path in recovery, but I accepted that. I did with spirituality what I was learning to do with the other aspects of the program. I took what I needed and left the rest behind. Over the years, I have accepted that other people's ideas about spirituality, ethics, and God are much different from my own. Part of the strength and beauty of NA is that there is room for all of us. What others call spiritual principles, I call ethical principles. Whatever they are called, the principles and the steps and traditions lead us away from active addiction, self-centeredness, and fear. When we help someone who is struggling, we break free from our self-obsession. When we give back, we cannot be greedy. We have found no limit to the possibilities of recovery for any member who practices the principles of NA, whether we call these principles spiritual or not. For some of us, the spiritual is simply the unseen or the intangible. Each of us has complete autonomy or anonymity in whatever concept we find for ourselves. The phrase "as we understood him" can be a sticking point for many of us. We do not have to understand or accept a higher power in order to live spiritually. No one else has the right to judge that or tell us our beliefs are right or wrong. What is important is that we are willing to accept one another's experience with an open mind and to share our experience without an effort to persuade one another of what is right or true. What keeps one of us clean might not work for someone else. We simply share what works for us. Being open-minded about our own beliefs as well as those of others frees us from the traps we set in our own minds. We can see our spirituality making a difference in our lives when we do the right thing for the right reason. That is what our basic text calls goodwill. We are able to listen to the voice inside instead of all the chatter around us. When we get tangled up in our differences and reservations, it's easy to forget why we bother with spirituality in NA. The basic text reminds us simply that we ease the pain of living through spiritual principles. Addicts feel life so acutely, and it's often this pain that drives us to use even when we know it won't actually make it better. We have been willing to trade even a moment's relief for a lifetime of hardship. Surviving our own lives seems impossible when we get here, but we learn gradually to face reality and make friends with the truth. The spiritual principles we practice help to take the edge off of that pain. And the more we practice, the more we find that those principles are the keys to freedom. Our lives get easier when we get clean in all our affairs. As we practice honesty, integrity, and fidelity, we no longer have to keep track of our stories or cover our tracks. We may be surprised to find that it is actually easier to live life this way. We can love our lives, find joy in being alive, and face the world with genuine excitement. Just as we get fleeting glimpses of God's will for us, we get fleeting glimpses of our own spirituality. Our spiritual condition is always changing. All too often we think we are unspiritual because our conscious contact comes and goes, or because we still have unkind thoughts, or because we still act out in ways we wish we didn't, even after many years clean. When we fall short, it doesn't mean that we are not spiritual. It means we are human. After all, if we never fell short, we couldn't practice our 10th step. Giving ourselves permission to be human means that we allow ourselves room to keep growing. We are living spiritually long before we know that's what we are doing. Spirituality is a relationship with reality. As we develop our spiritual lives, we find that reality becomes less frightening and less rigid. We learn to live with our freedom. We come to see that a change in our perspective can totally shift the way we understand our situation. When our lives are based in spirituality, our perceptions and responses are based in an ever-evolving relationship to something greater than ourselves. Self-obsession gives way to humility. We understand that we are not the main character in every play, but that our supporting efforts can make a real difference in the lives of those around us. As our spirituality develops, we become increasingly grateful for our lives and the people in them. The more good we can see in the world around us, the more grateful we become for the power that brings us to that awareness. When our bodies, minds, and spirits are in harmony, our lives show the difference. We are able to live in balance. Spirituality is practical. As our behavior is more consistently aligned with our beliefs, we come to a new sense of who we are. Even though we have a disease that requires us to be vigilant about our thinking, we can see both good and bad about ourselves. When we take inventory and practice paying attention to our actions and our motives, we sometimes feel like we are defined by our character defects. The most unpleasant things about ourselves are the things that can seem to be the most true. But even though we may see some painful things about ourselves, we know that's not the whole truth about who we are. We learn that our spirit is not apart from us. It is a part of us. We gain awareness of the exact nature of what is right about us. Our fractured personalities come back together into an integrated whole. Integrity is the state of being fully integrated. Our actions, our thinking, our feelings, our ideals, and our values all match up. It takes a long time for a lot of us to get here, and longer still for us to feel like it's real. More and more we are able to bring our behavior into alignment with our values and beliefs rather than our feelings and reactions. When we allow spirituality to be simple, we allow it to be universal. Whatever we believe our higher power to be, or even if we don't have one at all, we each have a spirit. The light on the inside that emanates us and makes us who we are. My spirit was the only thing alive in me, said a member. It was dragging my body around like a reluctant pet. Those times I thought my spirit was dead, it was fine, we just weren't on speaking terms. Newcomers sometimes ask when their spiritual awakening is going to occur. By the time we ask, it has already started to happen. We may not be able to pinpoint a single moment of spiritual awakening, but we know we are awake now. As we clear away the clutter that keeps us from the truth, we find that our light shines more and more brightly. It's the beauty we see in the eyes of someone who's really got it, a newcomer on that pink cloud. Or an old-timer whose radiance seems to fill a room. We feel it in a meeting as well. Many of us have walked into a building where several events were happening and noticed that the room with the NA meeting it felt like home. In the same way, we learn that finding God's will is often just a matter of showing up. When we show up for life with willingness and an open mind, the next right thing tends to present itself. We don't have to look that hard to find it. A sponsor suggested, introduce your feet to the floor when you wake up in the morning, show up to the shower to wash, show up to your appointments, and respect your commitments. When you hit a wall, turn left and find an opening. We learn to listen to our conscience, that still small voice within that tells us if we're heading in the right direction. The opening is often where we least expect it, leading us to a path, an opportunity, or a miracle we weren't looking for at all. There's more to creative action than just getting out of the way. Once we start to live, we have infinite choices on where to go with our lives. It begins with us showing up for life, but it does not end there. Another member shared, I invite my higher power into each moment. Asking for help with my daily routines helps me to love them more. I believe God's will for me is to live in gratitude, even for the little stuff. The ability to accept life on life's terms is an essential part of our spiritual awakening. We can either accept it or stay miserable. Living spiritually is about recognizing that there is room to grow. A member shared, "It's not a big eureka moment. It's the calm understanding that I am not doing the negative stuff I used to do. I feel myself in alignment with my world. We begin to experience awareness and empathy with others. Our confidence and strength are restored. We see ourselves as part of something greater and seek to live in harmony with it." None of this means that we automatically get what we wish for. Our relationship to a power of our understanding is too important to think it can only thrive in good weather. Life gives and takes, and it's not personal. The recognition of our awakening spirit includes being okay with life unfolding exactly as it does. But many of us have moments when we are not okay with what is happening around us. We are in pain, we are frightened, and often we are angry. Sometimes we get confused and think that to live spiritually means that we are happy and get what we want, and that if we're not happy or don't get our way, something is out of balance. It would be nice if it were true, but recovery is not a fairy tale. When we experience loss or disappointment, when we find ourselves faced with news we don't want to hear, or situations we'd give anything not to experience, it doesn't mean our spirituality is not working. In fact, it is at times like these that we can see it most powerfully. Our response to events and our sense of our role in them becomes more proportional and appropriate. We can respond to events without having to under or overreact. We can live in the present moment. Walking the walk. If our relationship to a power greater than ourselves is to be of any use to us, it must be honest. Learning to share our fear, disappointment, and anger takes courage. We pray in different ways. Many of us begin to talk to a higher power using formal prayers, and these can be incredibly powerful tools. I've said the same prayers every day throughout my recovery, one member said. They worked really well in the beginning, but now, 20 years later, they have a richness and meaning I could not have imagined. In addition, we learn to talk to our higher power in less structured ways, sharing our feelings, hopes, fears, and ideas. It can be important for us to remember to separate the words of a step from what people say about that step. Similarly, our relationship with a higher power, as it develops, may not adhere to the model set before us by others, and it may be very different from what we once imagined it to be. In this way, it really is like our relationships with human beings. Intimacy isn't predefined or predictable. Many of us share that one reservation we have about a higher power is that a powerful God would not allow things to happen as they do. What we saw as we endured the hell of addiction could not possibly have been the creation of a loving power. There are 1,000 ways out of this corner, and it's not our place to choose one for all of our members. What we find is not that our higher power spares us the hardships of life, but that we receive the grace to get through them clean. We can find the lesson in difficulty. We may find that some of the painful situations we once wanted to blame on God are a consequence of our own actions and decisions. Perhaps most importantly, the pain we endure can be transformed into a tool to help others. As we recover and carry the message, we discover that everything we have experienced can be a resource for us to find acceptance, empathy, and the words we need to help someone else find a way up and out of despair. We are powerless over our addiction, but in our surrender we become powerful tools for transformation. That transformation for each of us begins with surrender. Over and over we find that acceptance helps to free us from pain and suffering. We begin by accepting that we are addicts. From the first time we admit that we are powerless over our addiction and our lives have become unmanageable, we begin to feel relief. And that relief is the very beginning of the gratitude that will guide us throughout our recovery. Gratitude is not just a mood. It's a course of action, a way of setting ourselves in relation to the world. Sometimes it's a discipline. It can take work to hold ourselves in that attitude, especially when we are used to seeing the world through our filters of entitlement and resentment. Humility and gratitude walk hand in hand. We practice saying what we are grateful for whether or not we feel it. The feeling may not come naturally at first, but when we practice saying things, we start to recognize how much we have to be thankful for. Many of us start with the fact that we're not in withdrawal today. When we start to see how fortunate we really are, our questions don't frighten us as they once did. They may not be answered right away, but we start to see that our questions about the nature of God are much less important than the rewards we get from building the relationship, even if we don't understand it or fully believe it. Spiritual principles seem abstract until we put them into action. Our values are the principles we adopt to guide us. They may change over time, but when we change them for convenience or to please others, we know it. We make that mistake a few times before we learn to recognize it. We may stop acting on our defects, not because it's wrong, but because it just gets too uncomfortable for us. We can't stand the way it makes us feel. Often we act on spiritual principles before we internalize them simply because we want to save our lives. In the beginning, we learn principles by acting on suggestions. As we integrate spiritual principles into our lives, they become values. That is, we come to value some of them enough that they become part of who we are. When we are learning, we may be very rigid in our practice. As our practices become more integrated into our lives, we find that we can soften a little. My understanding of honesty was so rigid, said one member, that I could not even be tactful to spare someone's feelings. One day I was caught in a conflict between two sponsees. One called and confessed that he had done great harm to another, who happened to be in my home at the time. Brutal honesty with either of them would have made the situation much worse. I learned to balance the principle of honesty with the principle of anonymity. Since then, I've learned to balance it with kindness and compassion as well. We use the tools we associate with spirituality from our very early recovery. We practice prayer and meditation, we go to meetings, we take suggestions, we work steps. Once we can identify what our spirituality feels like to us, we recognize that other things in our lives are spiritual. Making music is an act of prayer for some of us. Walking out in the nature can be a meditation. I'm not a religious person at all, said one member. But I was out in the ocean one day floating, and I could feel my connection to the water holding me up, and the sky above, and the people on shore, and all of it. That feeling of connection was a powerful thing. When we practice our gratitude by sharing with others, we begin to feel our connection with one another and to something bigger. Each time we feel that connection, however we attain it, we understand a little more. We see ourselves as part of something greater and seek to live in harmony with it. When we achieve that harmony, the freedom we feel is unmistakable. We are freed from our feelings of alienation and inadequacy, and from the self-centered fear that once seemed to infect all of our thoughts and actions. That freedom comes and goes, but the first time we feel it, we are given a new hope that life might not have to hurt so much. Addiction is a painful disease. Our spirituality does not kill that pain, but it gives us the ability to move through it, past it, and out into the rest of our lives. We can accept our feelings, feel them, and move on. We begin to trust that the pain we feel at moments in our lives will not consume us. We can start to trust ourselves to feel without fearing that our emotions will destroy us. Part of learning is making mistakes. We learn as much by missing the mark as we do by finding our target. Inventory is the process of going back over our experience to discover where we were living in harmony with our values and where we were not. If we didn't take personal inventory, pray, and meditate, we wouldn't know whether we were practicing principles in all our affairs. We wouldn't be awake to reality. The steps keep us in tune with the principles, and they keep us in tune with ourselves. As we get better at it, we can identify earlier and earlier the points at which we begin to go astray. Often it's the smallest changes that make the biggest difference in our lives, in the same way that a small change in course greatly alters the destination of ships at sea. Small changes in the way we respond to life can free us from old, repetitive patterns and open us to new ways of thinking and acting. We practice with the spiritual principles. We try them out, go to extremes, drop them all together, and then find which ones have become important to us. As long as we are willing, we continue to change. Our values become clear to us as we act. The principles we once practiced as an exercise or because it was suggested become a part of us. Things that are profoundly difficult in the beginning of our recovery become second nature to us. We may not notice this change until we fall away from our new habits for a moment. For example, it can be very hard to start going to meetings again when we have been away for a while. Formally a habit, meeting attendance once again requires discipline. It gets easier with practice, just like it did the first time. As we get better at practicing our recovery, we fear ourselves less. We develop new skills and get used to the idea of practicing principles in new areas of our lives, even when we're scared. We come to know that pain can be a catalyst for growth, and not just a threat to our newfound equilibrium. On the other hand, we also learn that pain is not the same as growth. It must spur us into action if we want to find relief from it. We become more willing to take the action that will set us free. As our tolerance for pain starts to diminish, our need for change comes sooner. Spirituality in action. Understanding and embracing the steps and traditions is important for all of us, but we must use what we learn or it is of no value. When we engage in selfless service, we find that all the principles we have come to love and learn are called upon. It isn't easy to get out of our own way, but that is precisely what frees us from our self-made prisons. Sometimes it is clear that we need to change or we are in trouble. At other times, we are free to stay where we are, but it might mean selling ourselves short. There are many actions we can take when we need to change, but the simplest ones are often the most important. When we give to others, we get out of our own way enough to get a different perspective on our lives. Strangely, the most unselfish things we do are often the most rewarding. Selfless service is service to our higher power, our fellow human beings, and ourselves. When we are part of the process, we see a greater power working through us to make a difference in other people's lives. When we see it happen, we have a harder time denying its reality. We start out in survival mode and come to live a life beyond our dreams. Even though we have heard it said in meetings for years, it can still be a surprise when our world opens, and sometimes that can be very frightening. There are moments when life opens up before us with so many options that it seems strangely empty. We, who have chosen among bad options for years, often find that too many choices can make us really uncomfortable. We must come to terms with our own resistance in order to make a commitment to the program. We may be scared to make that leap. There is no way of knowing where it will take us. We can be afraid to want things too badly because it seems selfish, or because we fear they will be taken away from us. Another member shared, "I believed it was unacceptable to fail, and I believed I was a failure, so there really was no out for me. I needed tools to survive my own humanity." Freedom from our old ideas doesn't come easily, and it doesn't all come at once. Thank goodness for that. The truth is, if we went all the way through that process at one time, we might not survive it. Accepting our freedom is a massive act of spiritual courage. A member shared, "Early in recovery, someone told me I could have a life now. It was like I was hearing it for the first time. Life had been passing me by mostly because I could not see myself in it. NA gave me the spirit to be courageous about life again, just to go out and live. Our dreams and wishes can be a form of guidance. That fleeting glimpse might not be where we are actually going, but it may set the course for our journey." When we are willing to move toward our dreams, we end up living well beyond them. "I was afraid that if I got what I wanted, there would not be anything left for me to do in recovery," one member confessed. Meeting our goals is not the end of the story. The end of the journey toward a goal is often the beginning of a new phase in our lives. Many of us are used to being driven by crisis or calamity. It can take practice to learn to be motivated by something other than pain. Being willing to step out and act because something feels right to us takes a new kind of trust. Just as I struggle to list my assets in my fourth step, I struggle to list my goals and the things I enjoy now, one member said. We transform need into desire and obsession into determination. When we become willing to accept what it really means to set ourselves free, we are in for quite a ride. After years of recovery, we can look back at the work we have done and be grateful and satisfied, and we can see the terrible gaps in it as well. There's a moment in our lives when we may recognize how much of that work has been in service to the belief that if we do the right things, we will get what we want. When we realize what we have been seeking is not conscious contact, but constant comfort, we are appalled. Does this mean that my relationship with my higher power is false? Is my recovery a lie? Some spiritual awakenings are also rude awakenings. We see clearly, and what we see may be alarming. When we awaken to the darkness within ourselves, it hurts. "The first time I looked inside and saw the truth about some of the things I had done," said one member, "I thought that was the truth about me. I was terrified. I thought I had been given the opportunity to see all this grace around me, only to be shown it wasn't for me." The ability to change our assumptions about the world is one of the most important freedoms we have, because it enables us to see alternatives we could not imagine before. We disguised our low self-esteem as lack of interest in the world around us, and saw our lives as a narrow path between bad alternatives. "I saw myself as an obstacle to God's will," said another member. Our relationship to our higher power has suffered a lot of damage in our addiction, and it can be one of the hardest to amend. We know that indifference or intolerance towards spiritual principles is very dangerous for us, but sometimes we develop a different kind of intolerance after we have been clean for a while. We may develop a set of beliefs in recovery and resist anything that seems to threaten them or call them into question. But this is precisely the way that what we know about the truth can be revised. The truth is not what changes. It's what we know about it, how we understand it. As we get closer to the truth, we come to understand that it cannot hurt us, even if it is painful in the moment. A member shared, "Letting go of old beliefs was hard because I didn't really know what I believed to begin with. The work we do in the steps can help us to figure out what we believe and whether our beliefs still work for us. I used to feel embarrassed, strange, and empty when I prayed," another member admitted. "My relationship with my God required that I persevere. I had to keep praying through the times when I didn't feel anything. It took a long time for it to become natural to me. Being willing to keep trying when it feels hard or when it doesn't feel like anything at all is an act of faith. We get through these difficult times by having a daily spiritual practice. The habit carries us through until the feelings change. We have faith in the experience of our fellow members that somehow this practice is going to help. Willingness to step out and try a relationship with a higher power can be powerful, but we may hesitate in the beginning. We put a toe in the water first. We may struggle with prayer and meditation for a long time before we feel something engage. One member shared, "I experimented with different practices for 7 years before I found the right grace in the right place. Finding the path for my spirituality was like finding shoes that fit." Another member shared that she was so resistant to prayer that her sponsor resorted to extremes. "Put your basic text on the side of the room, sit on the other side, and reach out your hand," said the sponsor. "You have just prayed." However we do it, prayer is an act of reaching out for help and connection. It is an act of humility and honesty, and for some of us, it is the first honest or humble action we take. We can be much more comfortable in an old rut than on a new plateau. We usually don't notice that we're stuck until we have been there for a while, and by then it's hard to break free. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable if we don't want to stay stuck. Trying something new can be its own surrender. It can be very difficult to allow ourselves to experience our freedom. "As an addict, I'm a creature of habit," said one member. "The third time I'm in a restaurant, I order the usual." Our comfort with habits makes it easy to stay in a routine. Fear of the disease sometimes makes us afraid to step too far on a limb lest we find ourselves in danger. Trying out new perspectives, new beliefs, and new experiences can all be part of living spiritually. Our certainty can keep us from the humility we so desperately need. Open-mindedness is a cornerstone of our recovery, and that includes being open-minded about our own program. When we stop being teachable, we are in trouble. Too often we create barriers where guideposts are more appropriate. When we build walls instead of pathways, we don't just keep new possibilities out, we lock ourselves into old ways of seeing and thinking about the world. It is easy to get caught in our own trap this way. When we finally find some relief, we want to hold on to it. As that relief grows into joy and gratitude, it becomes more precious to us. We can be so afraid to lose what we have gained that we hold ourselves back from growth. We may believe there's only one way for NA to work, and that's the way it has worked for us so far. When a certain practice or way of being has saved our lives, we may refuse to deviate from it. That grit and resolve can save our lives, and it can be really useful when we are carrying the message as well. But with that hard edge comes the risk that we will simply become stubborn and close-minded, excluding members who don't do it the way we do. When we think we know exactly what the program has to offer, we don't leave room for it to grow or for us to continue to grow within it. Even worse, when the time comes that we need something more, we have convinced ourselves that it won't be available through NA. Our willingness to share our ongoing experience in recovery helps our groups to experience the same growth and renewal that we do as individuals. We have many beginnings throughout our recovery. Early on we learn that we can begin our day again at any time. As we progress, we learn that we can always begin a new journey in recovery, and we can start over whenever we need to. We don't need to blow up our lives to get a fresh start. We may think we are done when in fact we are just getting started. When NA has given us all we have asked for, that's the beginning of a new story for us, a new chapter. The achievement of our goals is a new beginning on our journey, and as the journey continues, we will need all the tools we have been given. Just because we've used them already doesn't mean it's time to turn them in. Conscious contact. As we develop more ways to relate to our higher power, we find benefits in all of our relationships. For some of us, this never comes to involve a higher power that we would call God. I trust that Unity in NA, said a member, that will reach out to me and be there when I reach out. NA has carried me when I could not walk. Learning to pray is a process. The journey is its own reward. I learned the Serenity Prayer without the first word because I knew I did not believe in that. When I was working the third step for the first time, I began to pray by saying thank you. Most of the time now, it's not please or thank you or any kind of dialogue. It just is. I take a deep breath and cherish this quiet moment of being connected. Prayer helps us to let go of our fear and distrust and to live in faith. We don't have to understand it for it to work. We open the door to a faith deep within that allows us to meet adversity with serenity. I strive to practice prayer in every moment, said one member. Of course I fail every day, but it's changing my perspective. I am very aware of the fragility and preciousness of life. Instead of giving so much thought to why things happen, we look for what we can learn. A member shared, in early recovery, my prayers were sporadic acts of desperation and surrender. I learned prayer as a way to practice conscious contact. Now I find if I can remember my higher power in the moment, my life becomes a prayer, my wisdom is activated in meditation, and I exist within the will of my higher power. I am spiritually free, the farthest from active addiction, and the closest to the pure joy of existence in the moment. Many members believe that our higher power communicates with us through the people who come into our lives. One member explained, sharing in meetings is my highest form of prayer because I know my higher power is there, I can feel it, and I don't hold back. Often, I need another person in front of me so I can pretend I'm talking to them when I talk to God. Sometimes I get answers through them. Active listening is a form of meditation. Some of the most important messages are delivered through some unlikely people. When we listen with an open mind, we can hear the message we need. One of the gifts of empathy is being able to hear one another's truth. We learn to settle inside ourselves. The spiritual peace becomes the root of our emotional stability, and it gives us the courage to take risk. When we can quiet our minds, we can better hear the answers we need. So often we are desperate for answers that are right in front of us. In some ways, conscious contact with our higher power is no different from any other relationship. Meeting a person every day at the same time and place is a good beginning in getting to know someone. But to improve that relationship, we have to be willing to share openly. Intimacy grows over time. When we are close to someone through a difficult time, we learn whether we can trust them. The relationships that carry us through hardship are precious to us. Being present and in the moment and feeling alive, aware, and connected are feelings we hear about most often when members are sharing about their experiences with prayer and meditation. Most of us don't feel that profound sense of unity in every waking moment, but just knowing that we can feel it sometimes brings a sense of security. The fleeting feeling I long for is peace within, based on nothing outside myself. I just have to be willing to put the world down long enough to have a chance at it. Even if we experience that peace for just a moment, we can keep it in our hearts as we move through our lives. A member said, I was so tired of the committee in my head talking endlessly about how I wasn't good enough and nothing would be alright. So one day in meditation, I gave them all musical instruments. You know, they're a pretty good band. When we notice the word ritual embedded in the word spiritual, we realize how important it is that our spirituality have some kind of regular expression. Practicing principles is just like any other form of exercise. The more regularly and consciously we do it, the better we get at it. When I don't practice my morning prayer, said one member, I feel disconnected, like I'm running on my own power. Of course, we do not tell anyone how, when, or where to pray. Conscious contact may not involve words at all, but some sort of regular pause for reflection is useful. I struggle with getting to 100%, said a member. I make good progress toward a goal, and then I get scared, back off, and berate myself for not making it all the way there. Regular spiritual practice teaches us the discipline to follow through on other commitments. The ability to complete a goal comes from the practice of diligence. Developing some autonomy from our negative feelings is one of the rewards of meditation. Our practice helps us to focus and see things through. We remember to put our program first and to respect our own limits. We strive every day to keep ourselves spiritually balanced. Sometimes we are more successful than others. When we act in love and humility, we are amazed at what we can accomplish. We stop being so afraid of ourselves and find the courage to stand up for what we believe. Our commitment to Narcotics Anonymous may be the first promise we ever keep. I always sought freedom from restraints or authority. The way I convinced myself of my freedom was by becoming a nomad. When you are never anywhere for long, you can pretend that your choices don't confine you, that you leave no trace on the world. My emotional luggage was always standing by the door. NA has asked me to do what I have never agreed to do before. To stay. We must come to terms with our own resistance in order to make a commitment to the program. But the unconditional love we learned in the fellowship is one of the most solid things we have experienced, trusting that gives us the courage to stay through our discomfort. More and more we find that the principles of the program guide our choices. The ability to choose wisely begins when we are able to be honest with ourselves about our motives and our desires. Sometimes doing nothing is the most spiritual thing we can do. It can keep us from having to make amends later, and it gives us time to seek guidance from our higher power. We can have our feelings without being had by them. Laughter and joy can be as spiritual as prayer and service. Some say that enlightenment begins when we lighten up on ourselves. Creative action of the Spirit. As we gain more confidence in our spirituality, we become more willing to improvise, not only in our spiritual practice, but in the way we live. We become willing to do the right thing and to let go of fear. We go from simply showing up and reporting for duty each day to a willingness to serve the greater good in the best way we can. We start by following suggestions and progress to doing the right things for the right reasons. We can stop there, but if we are willing to strive for more, we have the opportunity to exceed our greatest expectations for ourselves. Our experience settles a lot of ambivalence about spirituality. We can just go ahead and have the relationship with our higher power without worrying so much about the things we don't know or understand. Each time an experience reawakens us, we are more aware of the power nudging us to wake up to our lives. Great or small, our awakenings show in our willingness to practice the principles and carry the message. Service has much to teach us about our spirituality. It's how we show our love and gratitude, but it's also how we learn it. When we act together, we are greater than the sum of our parts, smarter than our decisions, and more powerful than we think we are. The second tradition reminds us that a loving God guides our efforts in service, and we can see it clearly when our short-term setbacks or disagreements somehow don't interfere with carrying the message. We see a higher power working in NA and come to believe it can work in our lives too. A member shared, "When my home group has put off a decision because some of us aren't sure what to do, we usually make a better decision later. I learned to do this in my personal life. When I take time to pray, I make better decisions." Some see our service to NA as a training ground. It's where we can learn to practice principles of acceptance and mutual respect. It's not always gentle, but we share a common purpose and a common bond. And because in NA we're all equal and all learning, we're always both the student and the teacher. No matter how long we've been around NA, there always seems to be the opportunity to learn a little more about ourselves when we get involved. I did some of my early service just to fit in. Over time I have developed a true desire to serve NA. Service makes me feel good about me. I'm useful, and I hope and pray each day for new members to join and help carry the message. It takes a long time for NA to grow. To stick with it, I have learned patience, hope, acceptance, love, and commitment. We can do so much in our world. Once we find recovery, our addiction no longer limits us. We are of value in and out of the fellowship. Today I understand I am an instrument of my higher power's will. I have a choice whether I will play in tune, create a new song, or just make noise for its own sake. By adhering to spiritual principles, we are able to live, work, and accept our situations in the real world, inside and outside NA. When we work the steps in order, we learn to apply them in our daily affairs. If we practice these principles, we never have to use again, and we can continually improve our ability to serve and cope with what life brings. We admit our powerlessness, ask for help, admit our errors, work on our defects, make amends, and ask for continued guidance. As we apply these principles to our daily thoughts and actions, we enhance the quality of our lives. We begin to sort ourselves out with the steps as an ongoing part of our lives. Sharing ourselves, whether we are telling our story or reading our inventory, helps us to bring order to the chaos. We experience deeper spiritual growth each time we embrace a step. Over and over we surrender, let go, and trust the process. Each time another door opens inside us. The gnawing hunger we felt inside is filled as we practice prayer, meditation, and service. As our defects release the chokehold they once had on us, we are freed to live fully. The narrow choices that once defined us give way, and we begin to dream, imagine, create, solve problems, or just seek joy in life itself. Our NA program provides a solid foundation. We can use that foundation to achieve anything as long as it is centered in spiritual principles. We learn to trust the principles of NA to guide us in all our affairs. It is important to have conviction about what we do. We no longer change who we are to match who happens to be around. Because of this new sense of conviction, we have a clear path to follow. Before NA, I was a coward and a follower. My spiritual awakening compels me to stand firm in my beliefs, offered a member. Resentment, fear, and arrogance cut us off from the ability to be spontaneous, creative, and free. We open that channel when we begin to take selfless, loving action. We learn to respect and love people without seeking approval. We become responsible members of our communities, taking what we learn in the meetings and practicing that in our lives. Service matters in the world. At different times, our paths lead us to be of service to others, directly or indirectly. One of the most wonderful feelings we know is that of being a part of humanity. When we practice spiritual principles, we experience awareness and empathy with others. Spirituality teaches us to feel human. After so many years of isolation, a feeling of well-being arises within us, assuring us that we are right where we're supposed to be. We put this way of life into practice with our families, people we work with, and all of our other relationships. We do the best we can each day. Sometimes we improve just a little bit. At other times we make big progress in practicing the principles, or we really fall short. Our progress is not always steady, but we can see it happening over time. We learn to live our principles. We begin to say no when something is not right for us, even if we might lose someone's approval in the process. We learn to take care of ourselves and our responsibilities, and not to blame others when things don't go our way. We start to see the opportunities for growth that are available to us on our best and worst days. Hope and freedom from active addiction come to us early and are given freely. This is what some of us call the pink cloud. We don't have to work for it, but there comes a time when there is no more just taking. This is a crossroads. Many of us stop here and never know what we have missed. We get the real rewards of recovery by giving back and giving forward, out of gratitude for what has been given and out of hope for what is to come. Being of loving service is living spiritually. First we take, then we give, then we share. Living fully is a creative expression of love for our higher power. To be fully alive, awake, and honest about who we are is a gift to us and from us. Our spiritual connection leads us forward into a new life of joy, wholeness, and endless learning. We discover within ourselves a passion for living. Our experience is transformed into tools for healing and keys to compassion. We find within ourselves a clarity and beauty we never suspected we had. In whatever way we experience conscious contact, a feeling of acceptance and relief from turmoil seems to come for all of us. The principles of Narcotics Anonymous are the tools we need to deal with whatever life brings. Seeking our higher power's will for us brings us ever closer to our own heart's desire to feel loved, useful, and part of something greater than ourselves. The spiritual foundation we find in NA gives us the confidence to live and enjoy life, to help others, and to carry the NA message secure in the knowledge that we are guided exactly to where we need to be. We begin to feel connected to the world around us, and our lives have purpose. We find the courage to follow our heart, to listen to the voice within, to create, to commit, to explore, and to live. We arrive at Narcotics Anonymous hoping for survival. What we find is love, courage, a sense of connection, and a sense of direction. All our lives we had looked for the peace and safety we experience in recovery. As we seek our higher power's will for us, we come to an understanding of our purpose. Spiritual awakening is a process. Maybe it's what the whole process is about. We nurture our awakening spirits, and we know that we are finally free to live in grace, integrity, and dignity.